today we're going to be talking about broadly the idea of attorney compensation standards with a focus on using overhead studies and tools like that to advocate and or make decisions about compensation standards. It's a packed panel today, so we'll be starting with Margaret Gressens from the North Carolina IDS, then Chris Sadler from Michigan IDC, and myself, I'm from the Indiana Public Defender Commission. I'll let you guys should introduce yourselves as well, but just to give a quick overview at the beginning. And then we will also be joined by 2 additional speakers that we added just earlier this week. Thank you guys again. That's Kathy Doherty from the Onondaga County ACP in New York, and Cheyenne Burke, who is the Associate Director of Governmental Relations for the New York State Bar Association. All right. With that, as I said, it is packed. We'll try to have some time for the questions at the end. So I'm going to pass it over to Margaret and let her start talking. All right.
Share my screen again.
Yep.
All right. You all see that? We good? Okay. So this is our effective pay study that we did back in 2019. So it's based on 2018 attorney data. It's on our website and the link is at the bottom. So you guys can download the whole thing if you want. We sent it out to over 2,300 attorneys across the state. And we got 322 responses, so just under 15%. And we were actually thrilled with that response rate because this was a labor-intensive survey asking for a lot of detailed, itemized financial data from our attorneys. And we got what we wanted, so we were very happy. All right, it's not. Okay. All right, so it was not just a survey about overhead, it was also a survey about the other parts of your payment packages that judges, clerks, DAs, prosecutors get routinely, which are your benefits, your taxes, your health, your retirement, your life insurance. So we wanted to know about more than just overhead. We wanted to know about could they afford health insurance? We also wanted to get a little bit of information about our culture here that expects public defense cases to be handled lickety split with very little work. And so judges routinely cut fees is what we heard. So we wanted some documentation on that. We also heard that attorneys self-cut because they don't want to have their judges cut their fees. So we wanted to collect a little bit on that. And then we did some research collecting some information about what federal public defenders get paid and what retained attorneys get paid for different case types. So this was an incredibly effective survey for us. So fees have been drastically cut in North Carolina in FY11 as a response to the financial crisis that hit us and everybody in 08 and 09, 26% slashed across the board. So it was huge cuts for people. And even though North Carolina recovered, we have been advocating for years to restore rates, at least restore them, even if we don't adjust them for inflation, and we had gotten nowhere. In fact, our director was spending some money hiring a communication consultant, trying to figure out how we can make more of an impact. But this study was like a trigger for us. That budget year, when the study came out, we released it right before the budget year. The Justice and Public Safety Committee had basically $4 million to play with that year. Not a lot of money, but that was it. And they gave it all to us. And it was specifically earmarked to do nothing more than raise PAC rates. And we think this was effective, I mean, personally, because instead of being like a research report, we made it tell a story. It told the story of how much sacrifice and how painful it was to be a public defender in terms of financially what they had to give up. And we made it when we got the survey back, we had all these comments from attorneys, and when you read all their surveys, it was really powerful. So we figured out a way to get their voices into the report, and it was basically the format of this report. Every page had a sidebar, and those sidebars were either direct quotes from the attorney or simple bullets that just kind of revealed what life was like for a public defender. And you could just read the sidebars and nothing else in the study and walk away with the message that we wanted. So like, what am I talking about? So at the end of the study, 2 of our attorneys make less than $10 an hour. 1 in 10 actually loses money when they do our work. 1 in 10 have no health insurance at all, and 4 in 10 only have it because of a spouse or parent. 8 in 10 have no ability to save for retirement. Most can't afford an office. They have to practice out of their home. They can't afford malpractice insurance. They can't afford to start a family. They have to wait. 7 in 10 are solo practitioners with absolutely no support staff whatsoever, which from our point of view, from an efficiency point of view, isn't ideal, right? Because attorneys are the most expensive piece of the work we do. And then many had either drastically cut back on the work they'd done for us, or they had left us completely. But even more so was the quotes. They were just so powerful. I've been doing indigent defense work for 25 years, and I am being paid less than I was 10 to 15 years ago. I've watched the salary of other segments of the criminal justice system increase, while attorneys who perform indigent defense decreases. It says we are not important. I put off the purchase of personal items like groceries because I am concerned the money will be needed elsewhere, like to pay the mortgage. I have filed for bankruptcy. I've defaulted on student loans. I've had to do other work to make ends meet. I end up spending less time on my court-appointed cases than I should. I'm surprised the state has not been hit with a class action lawsuit. I mean, peppered throughout the report are these personal stories that show that to do this work, you have to sacrifice your own personal financial well-being and that of your family. And then we ended the report by bringing back the personal to the system level with this really powerful quote we got from one of the attorneys. It's not possible to provide competent representation to a defendant for what amounts to less than $200 for an entire case. And the attorney has to handle dozens of cases at a time. Witnesses are not interviewed. Evidence is not reviewed. Trials are virtually out of the question. So it's a plea factory. If this is a shocking suggestion, it should be. That is actually the reality of the current situation, with the malpractice insulation being that although these clients know they are getting treated like cattle, they don't have the means to hold anybody accountable. So we got this incredible quote that's just an indictment of how broken the system was. So that's my biggest tip for what made this effective, was those telling the personal story. And then in terms of just doing the survey, because I know you've got a lot of other people to hear from. So timing, because we wanted really detailed financial information, we did it before tax time because they had to collect this information to do their taxes. We gave them a free gift for all their work, and that can be problematic. But we didn't give them a fun thing. We gave them a legal resources. 2 powerful resources had just come out, and they cost around $50, so they were pretty pricey. So if you filled out the survey, you got to pick which one you wanted. So people were really happy with that. Planned to do a lot of work on your part, doing the survey, creating as many tools as possible to help them complete it. We wanted things like their billable hours, how much work they do for public defense. So every time we asked something, we gave them a tool to make them really quickly figure it out. And then the last thing I'll end with, so that we can move on and hear from other people, is if you don't have the staff or the labor or the resources to do a survey, you could just figure out your own effective pay in your jurisdiction by just doing some research, figure out what the average cost for all the elements are. And then the average cost for each piece. What is the average cost in your area for health insurance, for life insurance, retirement? And then you can calculate what their effective pay is. And I'll leave it there so we can hear from other folks.
Perfect. Thank you, Margaret. You
If
go
I
ahead
can figure out how to stop share. Okay.
There you go. And I'll pass this off to Chris. If you click the little stand in. Oh yeah, you got it.
Yeah, sorry, I had everybody's pictures everywhere.
Yes, understandable.
We're straight. Sorry about that. All right, so my name is Christopher Sadler. I work with the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission as their research associate. My background is in public administration as well as economics, specifically econometrics. So I'm just going to quickly cover the survey and the things we did in order to collect the information used to determine wage rates for attorneys. So just a quick note on profit. It seems to be a philosophical debate on the level of profit, somebody profiting off of indigent defendants. This has been going on for ages, but that's not something that I'm sure we're really interested in. So I found it very important not to get sucked into those conversations. Really, an attorney earning a wage is an incentive. And the thing we focused on is this equation at the bottom, that profit equals total revenue minus total costs. So we had to break down the costs and sort of determine what it is we're going to look at. What is the information we need to know? So we broke it into fixed cost and variable costs. Fixed costs are those things that aren't going to change whether you're producing or not. Variable costs are those things that are going to change based on the amount of production. So those are just some quick examples there of what a fixed cost may look like or a variable cost may look like. And you'll find that there is sometimes this world in which they merge together, and that's important to separate that out. And that's knowing your population, knowing what is their costs. The next thing we wanted to focus on is how attorneys allocate their time, because that's a choice, isn't it? Here in Michigan, the choice is, am I going to take retained work or am I going to accept appointed work? And we found that we had fewer attorneys in Michigan practicing appointed work than would be preferable. Because one of the things this analyzing the decision mechanisms is trying to understand what goes into that decision, because it's not always the amount of money that they can make. Because some people have suggested that, you know, why would you give up retained work if you're going to make less in appointed work? So it's a lot about that, because there's this opportunity cost. Because if you accept appointed cases, you're not accepting retained cases, and that could cause problems for your bottom line. It also could run you into the red financially, and we saw some folks doing that, barely making ends meet because they get a lot of intrinsic motivation from representing indigent clients, and that just didn't feel right. So we need to create some sort of balance. And our survey was fairly holistic. We didn't just collect financial information. We also went into asking questions about feelings and attitudes towards indigent defense, towards the work that they're doing. We surveyed attorneys who currently practice indigent defense and current attorneys who no longer practice indigent defense, and tried to tease out the reason why they do. and also attorneys who have reduced or increased the caseload of indigent defendants that they take. So just quickly on to revenues. We were flat out. We just asked, how much money do you make? And then we started breaking it down. This was, we asked folks to list their annual incomes, or rather their annual revenue generated. And then we asked them to identify the amount that is retained work versus appointed work in other streams. And we wanted to focus specifically on criminal defense, because attorneys here in Michigan, as with a lot of other places, do a number of aspects of law as part of their practice. So we did have some scenario-based questions. This also helped with the legislature and also helped with the commission as being able to identify the opportunity cost of taking indigent defense cases. So for example, we would give scenarios, and we did rely heavily on scenarios because as we found in the testing phase, a lot of folks just didn't collect the information. A lot of it was stored in their head, not necessarily, I mean, on paper somewhere, but I mean, attorneys aren't accountants, generally speaking. It's not something that they do or allocate a lot of time towards. So we would ask these questions and try to get at, under this scenario, what would you earn if this were an appointed case? What would you earn if this were a retained case? So the next thing we did, we developed simulations regarding time allocation. So we would give a specific hourly rate. Let's say you were earning this hourly rate, and we'd also identify, let's say your costs were this, so that your profits were such and such per hour. How much time would you allocate to this specific area of your practice? How many hours would you allocate to this specific area of your practice? And we used we standardized it to a 40-hour work week, recognizing that attorneys work far more than that, but we did just need something that each attorney could look at and say, okay, this is all I get, 40 hours. You're not getting your income from anywhere else. You don't have the ability to work anywhere else. You only earn your income in order to get a livable wage, and here are the constraints. Under these constraints, how do you operate? So once we collected that information, I just want to give a really quick word about the analysis. It was a lot of data. This was a pretty long survey, and it did require some somewhat sophisticated statistical techniques. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that at all. A lot of folks are like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with all this data if I go through this process, collect all this information? I don't have the skills to do that. That's okay. You can find somebody who will do it. And if you can't, I mean, I will do it for you. I mean, this is really important. And I'm not kidding when I say that. This is the stuff that I love. This is the stuff that I do. This is what I went to school for. This is like second nature to me. So do not get caught up in that, because I think a lot of folks, or at least my experience has been that a lot of folks do not go into these really important projects related to data because they're not quite sure what to do with it or how to use it. We could run courses on that, and you have plenty of people in this network that have the ability to do that. And like I said, I mean, reach out and we can walk you through it. So now comes the hard part. We did this project about 2 years after the MIDC went online. So once we were done, we sort of had to turn back the clock and like, oh, what do we wish we could have done? Well, there was a lot of things that we just didn't know. We had problems with distributing the survey because at the time, the MIDC did not have a list of attorneys that practice criminal defense. So we were relying on listservs. We were relying on the attorneys in the office who used to practice criminal defense, them to send it out. And we got a few hundred, about 300 responses back, which was nice. But if we were to do this today, given that we have direct access to attorneys, We know who they are. We have contact information to. We believe we probably would have gotten a better response rate. The other thing that I wish we would have done in the testing phases, because I don't recommend just coming up with a survey and sending it out. You got to test it, because as you're writing that survey, the thing that means something to an economist might not mean anything to an attorney. So we did test it with attorneys, but what we found as the responses coming back in is that some of the attorneys that we tested it with, the ones that were willing to do that, were a little more prepared to have the information necessary. So we did receive a fair number of incomplete surveys or surveys with clearly inaccurate data, and those had to be kicked from the analysis, unfortunately. So what we would have liked to have done is just spent more time with different attorneys rather than this one core group of testers, because what happened is in hindsight, it seems like an obvious thing, but it wasn't at the time. We used the same core group of attorneys to test the survey through multiple iterations, meaning they had plenty of practice with it. They understood it. The other thing that I wish we would have done is probably kept the survey open longer. We kept it open for a few months. And in hindsight, given the constraints, probably should have kept it open an entire summer or done it multiple times per year. We were sort of constrained. I mean, we're talking about as we're looking back, like if we could have done this, we couldn't. We had a very limited amount of time, and we had only a certain window to do this survey. So we did, and it ended up being in the summer. The way Margaret described it and the timing of her survey would have much more ideal, because all that stuff is top of mind. So I'm hitting 10 minutes right now, but I just want to say thank you, and please reach out. There is a lot of information regarding this process that I have. I do have a few things written down that I can share with folks. Just shoot me an email. Always willing to talk about this. But there's just a lot more to it than just this presentation can show. And really, we're open to talking about this whenever. We really like this stuff, and it's such important work. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris. I can confirm when we were developing our overhead study, I had at least one long phone conversation, it may have been multiple, with Chris talking about these issues. So it was very helpful. And obviously, it's you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Although I will say, as you can already tell just from two presentations, that there are significant differences in like the aims and also the problems and concerns that these surveys are addressing. So I think that's one of the reasons why a panel was the best approach for this, is that all of the panels seem to, or all of the members of the panel seem to have, different concerns and different approaches and things like that. Okay, so am I up here? All right, I'm gonna assume I'm up. Okay, so as I said, I'm Torrin Liddell. I'm from the Indiana Public Defender Commission. I am the research and statistics analyst there. We did this overhead study in 2019. It was sent out as a survey. But before I get into that, I want to sort of highlight something that I think is a unique aspect of our system, and why I think this panel approach was useful. So in Indiana, we have 3 pay models. So what we call hourly, which is what most places would call appointed, where it's, there's a public roster and a judge will appoint an attorney. In Indiana, at the time of this survey, and still now, the minimum for those people was $90 an hour, which I think is pretty good, at least in comparison to other states. Maybe not, certainly not necessarily great in comparison to what you could get if you were doing private work, but still pretty good. Then we also have salaried people, which is what most people would think of as like a public defender office. Although I will say that we have people that are part-time salaried, where they're paid by the county, they're employees of the county, they get benefits from the county, but they only work half-time for the county and they work out of their own offices. So it's not, they're still covering some overhead, which is why I say overhead is usually covered. And I'm using overhead very broadly here, just like Margaret was, and kind of like what Chris said at the beginning too, regarding his, what counts as profit and what counts as overhead. We used the same approach, where just anything that you're not taking home to pay for your own expenses, that's overhead. So it will include things like payroll taxes and health insurance and stuff like that, not just in office and staff. So that's one model. And under our current rules, the salaried people have to be paid the same as the opposing prosecutor. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means later. And then the contractors, which are very similar, except they're not employees. They're just contracted with the county, but they are paid a standard yearly wage. They're not being paid hourly. So, the county will pay you $30,000 to cover this many cases, as an example. And that would be like, near halftime probably in our state on average, a little less maybe. So those are the people that we were targeting, because they have to be paid in parity with the opposing prosecutor, but they have to cut out all the overhead themselves. So that means that the opposing prosecutor that is an employee is actually effectively being paid considerably more than what those contractors are being paid. So that was our area of concern. We knew it was a problem. This was our method of kind of quantifying that problem and getting an idea of what needs to be done to fix it. Okay, so I'm going to skip over all of the what we did in terms of the questions that we asked and stuff, and start with the headline, which is that the median overhead that we got in the sample that we got was $54,000 a year, a little over, for a full 40-hour work week for one attorney, which is quite significant. And that's especially salient because what we call the no comparable prosecutor position. So that's when a county says, we want to hire somebody, but there aren't any deputy prosecutors, or the deputy prosecutors are only, covering child support cases and they're funded with federal dollars. And so they're not comparable at all, as an example. So currently that number is just over $60,000. That's what you have to pay them if there isn't a comparable prosecutor. So, and relatedly, the median pay was about $64,000. So we know that no comparable prosecutor position tends to drive compensation for a variety of reasons. One, like if that's what the wage is for oh, my cat's coming to help. If that's what the wage is for the standard pay for a public defense position, that's the prosecutor is going to aim there too, or maybe a little higher. And then, if that's what the prosecutor amounts tend to be, then that will be, in the cases where there are comparable prosecutors, what those attorneys get paid. That standard number tends to drive the average median pay, and it ends up a little higher, say. So what we did to get our real headline number was to look at that typical pay, subtract out the overhead to get the actual pay. So they're getting paid about $10,000 on average, and then figure out what they're actually being paid hourly. So we shoved that through a 40 hours a week, just like Christopher said. We used a standard 40-hour week, even though we know that's probably not actually accurate, especially for people who are taking a lot of public defense cases. They're probably also doing a lot of private work. So that gives them an effective rate of about $5 an hour for their public defense work. That number has been the single most effective thing that has probably come out of any research like this that we have done, because it's kind of a slap in the face number. We got a lot of interest from the public. It did the local news circuit. I was on the radio for an hour, which is very unusual for me. I'm usually a private researcher in a room sending stuff to other interested parties. But for whatever reason, this level of underpayment essentially was very interesting to people. So we looked at a couple potential solutions, like ways to get that number higher. One was to just increase the minimum pay standards or the standard pay to basically get that number higher in general. So just overall make it so public defenders are being paid more. But that it's a stopgap insofar as it doesn't address the disparity between contracting public defenders and the opposing prosecutors, for instance. So it really doesn't directly address the issue that we were trying to address, but it does, it helps the people that are most harmed by this insofar as they, are making essentially no money. They're just covering overhead with their public defense work. At least they would be making some money, even if it was still significant inequity between them and the prosecuting side. Another option is to implement a required overhead compensation for contractors. So that would involve, saying if you're going to use this contractor system, you have to pay, maybe that $50,000 a year in addition to whatever the prosecutor is getting paid, in order to, be considered to be in parity. This is something we are still looking at, but generally the counties that are using this program, like a primarily a contractor-based system, are the least resourced PD programs. And in Indiana, unlike in some jurisdictions, they do have an option. If we say you need to give everyone a $50,000 raise, they can say no and just stop taking state money. So any change that we make is always a negotiation between the increased costs that we're putting onto the counties and the money that we give them, which is a percentage of their costs. So that is still something we're looking at, but it is a very significant change to make, and it may result in some worse outcomes in the counties that are the poorest, because they would say, we literally can't afford that. We're just going to refuse your state money, and then maybe go to an even worse system than they were before we made that change. So that's always a concern. So what actually did happen, we are increasing that base pay, that $80,000 per year, that $60,000 per year is going up to $80,000. Part of that was these overhead results that gave us that kind of political ability to do that. There have also been hiring concerns in terms of jurisdictions just being unable to hire at that $60,000 amount. They just can't find anyone to do the work. But as I said, this does not help contractors that are already in parity with the opposing prosecutors. So those prosecutors that, or those PDs that they have an opposing prosecutor and they're already being paid the same as them, so that this won't change their pay. But as I said, this standard number does tend to drive what the overall typical number tends to be. And again, this isn't a direct solution to overhead, but hopefully that will be coming. But small steps at a time. I don't know, I don't have the chat up. I'll paste this in the chat as soon as I stop sharing the screen, because right now it's it's all covered. But it is available on our website. There is a lot more detail in there. And thank you. I will pass this off to the advocates from New York now. Okay. And then hopefully we'll get to questions.
So the good news is I don't need to share a screen.
Yes.
Because we haven't done a study. So I'm Kathleen Doherty, and I am the director of the Assigned Counsel Program for Onondaga County. Onondaga County has the primary city is Syracuse, New York. I'm sure some of you have heard of Syracuse, the home of many snowstorms and the orange basketball and football teams. So Onondaga County and the state of New York have a few different options for how to run a indigent defense program. In Onondaga County, unlike most of the counties in New York, we have a primary assigned counsel program, an ACP. And most likely because we have a law school here. So, you know, the lawyers want income and they want to stick around and they want to get paid. So this has been, I mean, it's been established here for about 30 years. It was one of the 5 counties in New York that was sued because of the dire state of indigent defense, the you know, cutting of vouchers, you know, all the things that everybody knows goes on when left to run themselves by the county, is that the county would keep slashing the funding. So we had a lawsuit. There was a settlement agreement called Harrell Herring, and as a result of the settlement, we were one of the 5 counties to get quite a bit of funding, a lot of funding from the state to turn the program around. I was brought in at that point. I was not part of the assigned counsel program until 5 years ago. But the critical problem that we face is that the rates are extremely low. So it's $60 per hour for misdemeanors and $75 an hour for everything else. And by everything else, I mean, you know, felony work, family court work, appellate work. So I currently have about 150 attorneys on the panel who take assignments, but the number fluctuates, and it's actually more like 140 now, because we are kind of losing people because the number, you know, the hourly rate is so bad. Our biggest issue, honestly, has been to educate the public, to educate the legislature about what it means to earn 50, 60, 75 bucks an hour, because it sounds like, you know, oh, that's a lot. I pay my plumber that's a lot of money. And so I came up with an analogy that I think is probably the easiest for people to understand. And I was in front of our legislature and they were asking why I was pushing, because I've been very involved in pushing the legislation to get the rates increased. And I said, you know, $60, $75 an hour sounds like a lot. I said, but it's as if your attorney was running a small shop and they were bringing in, their revenue was $60 or $75 an hour. I said, they have to keep the lights on, they have to pay the rent, they have to do all those things. And suddenly you could see the light bulb kind of come on with quite a few of the legislators thinking, oh, that's what it means. It isn't, you know, 60 or 75 bucks in their pocket. And so I feel like, at least in New York, that has been the biggest hurdle, is getting people to understand what an hourly rate means to an attorney. We have a federal courthouse right down the street from me. They are making $158 an hour for the same defense work, federal defense work. And I've had so many attorneys, they may not leave our panel, but they say, don't, you know, I don't want as many cases. I'm going to cut back how many cases I'm going to accept, because I can do the federal work and it's a lot more lucrative, relatively speaking. The legislation right now that we are pushing, and we have a lot of support, but this has been several years now that we've been trying to get this done. And that would double the rate. So it would be 120 for misdemeanor work, 150 for everything else. But more importantly, it would include a cost of living adjustment, because up till now, the rates are statutory, and about every 17, 18 years, they decide that maybe we should, you know, throw a few bucks at the lawyers. So we would make it, you know, a COLA part of the legislation, so that we don't have to do this every year, you know, several years. And the other piece of it, which is extremely important for getting it across the finish line, is to have the state pay the difference. So the county is obligated to pay the first $60 to $75 an hour. The state would be obligated to pay the difference. And so it isn't an unfunded mandate for the counties, which is a popular way of doing things in our state. And so the, I mean, there's also a lawsuit that's going on right now, because that is actually how the rates got increased 18 years ago, is because some of the bar associations sued the state and, saying that we're not providing quality representation because we don't have enough attorneys. We have huge caseloads. My county is under the settlement agreement to, I have to make sure that the caseloads don't exceed a certain number. It's complicated. We'll call it 300 points. And so, how do you do that when you're losing attorneys? And it's a constant battle. Cheyenne is on the lobbying end of the street, which, I wish I could join her in that part, but I actually have to run a program. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cheyenne Burke. I work for the New York State Bar Association, primarily lobbying. Prior to this, I worked in the New York State Assembly for several years, central staff. So I have a little bit of experience on the inside, and now I'm trying to use that on the outside. But one of the main legislative priorities of the New York State Bar Association is raising the assigned counsel rates. As Kathy said, everything's in statute. So we have to go through the legislature and the governor every time we want to get a raise. So when I see your guys' reports, I love them because a huge part of my job is essentially, bringing in the anecdotal and bringing in the empirical evidence to show why this needs to be done and putting it in a digestible form for the legislature, essentially. And when I worked on the inside, I used to love these reports to be able to explain to members why things are issues. I think that a lot of the data points can be very, very compelling. It can shore legislators up in their votes. And, I've always found them really great, provided we can put them in a digestible format, which I think is what a lot of this stuff comes down to, is taking a lot of the data points people get and finding a way to make it resonate with them. As part of the NYSBA's advocacy with it, as Kathy mentioned, I'm not aware of any overhead study breaking down the New York rates. It would be amazing. But at least on the lobbying side, attorneys aren't always the most sympathetic group, right? So when we're talking to legislators, we really need to know, what's their district look like? How many people might benefit from this? Are they losing attorneys? And those are, some types of things that we've tried to hit on. Your panel is bleeding attorneys, and while no one has sympathy for attorneys, that means people aren't getting representation. That means their cases are getting delayed. That means they're proceeding pro se because they feel like they have no choice. And that is terrible. And that's what, I find is resonating with, a lot of those members. So I guess that's kind of, my spiel on the lobbying side is just that the surveys you guys do, it's fantastic. The number that Torrin mentioned, the $5 an hour, that's the type of thing that, they might not be like, okay, attorneys aren't getting paid enough, but you drop that number, and they understand, like, okay, this is a problem. And it is a problem in New York. That's why there's a lawsuit. That's, why they're actually starting to look at it. But at least when you're trying to lobby, especially when you have a fiscal ask, having data points and anecdotal stories to really underscore, look, this is happening in your district. This is stories that is your constituency, and here's the numbers to back up, why you need to vote for this, why you need to make this a priority in your funding asks. It can be really, really compelling. And I do think that it can be very impactful and get bills across the finish line.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, Torrin, I want to underline what Cheyenne said. We
Sure.
have not done any kind of overhead study. We do keep track, however, of the work that our attorneys do. We have a quarterly survey that we ask our attorneys to fill out in order to find out how much time they're spending on their assigned cases versus how much time they spend in total on all their cases. And it's a really good bar for us to look at, you know, because we're doing it across the entire panel. They have to fill out the form in order to continue to be able to vouch your cases. So it's a, you know, there's no way to get around it. And, you know, sometimes it's a carrot, sometimes it's a stick. And so, but it does give us a good sense. And then we can look at our attorneys, how many cases they're handling, and knowing, oh, and I'm only spending 50% of my time on indigent cases. And so, you know, it's just, it's a way to check in to see how overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but usually overwhelmed our attorneys are as far as the work that they're doing. And, you know, that whole idea of what's your incentive for doing indigent work. And, you know, especially with the rates being so low. We have some fantastic attorneys who are truly motivated to do this work. And, you know, we try so hard to find different ways of like making it worth their while so that they can continue to practice, you know, especially kids coming out of law school and especially with the loans. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, thank you both. I'm glad we got some time for questions. Feel free to unmute and ask questions. Or drop them in the chat box, whichever you prefer. I'll be watching it. I noticed I missed one from you, Eric, while I was talking, because my screen was too full of things, where you asked about what I mean by full-timers. That's just another communication shorthand that we use, because whenever, you know, if we just talk about our contractor attorneys, you know, there's a lot of questions about like, oh, like, is this, you know, we have a lot of concerns at the legislature that like these attorneys are actually, you know, they're just doing a little bit of public defense work, and then they're just, you know, they're basically private attorneys, and that any increase to them is just subsidizing their own private practice, right? So when I say full timer, I'm just talking about like, if, you know, if we take what people make and assume they were full time, this is what they would make. We do have full time contractors. We have a significant number of them, but a lot of them are half time. None of them get benefits though. If, well, I shouldn't say none, but essentially none of them get benefits, because if they get benefits, they're not considered a contractor for the most part. But with that, I'll open it to the group for questions or discussion or anything.
Yeah, on the topic of overhead and these contractors, we have full-time people who are W-2s and they get benefits, but there are very, very few of them, and they're limited to just a few districts. Most of our attorneys we call mainly public defense, and they work less than 40 hours. They do some private cases, but we're their bread and butter. Sometimes we provide office space in some districts. Sometimes they actually work out of their own office. And we have part-timers who work less than 20 hours. And then we have intermittents that just work a few cases a year. You know, that fourth co-defendant on some kind of crazy arrest. But one of the interesting and maybe sad and maybe immoral things is we are kind of subsidizing our chief defenders in each of the 42 districts. Many of them are running, you know, a lot of cases for us out of their office. And they are essentially subsidizing the overhead for the state system. And just across the river from Baton Rouge, where I'm at, in the 18th JDC, our chief defender, who's been there for 50 years as chief defender, his office is the public defense office, but they, you know, they're also running private cases. So it's a strange mix of, I mean, how do you calculate the value of that? And yet we really need to put a price tag on this whole statewide system.
That was one of our big motivations as well, because we have the same issue, not with chief defenders, because we successfully, if you're a chief public defender and you're going to be called a chief public defender, the county has to give you an office. That's one of our rules that we have managed to get. But we have a ton of people that are doing, you know, that they're full-time public defenders. They're taking a full-time caseload, but they're working out of their private office. So yeah, that was a major reason we wanted to do this, was to to be able to quantify that. And that's why we pointed this survey at those people. We pointed it at people that aren't working out of an office that is staffed by the county. We pointed it at basically anyone else. And then we, were able to get an idea of how much we could expect a person to be spending.
We're going to have a hard time because it's a hybrid office for that attorney. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Anybody has any ideas, please, even if it sounds crazy, I'm willing to consider it.
I'll share an interesting development with low rates here in North Carolina. So we've done outcome studies, and we have lots of different ways we provide services. And our public defender offices, head and shoulders, get better outcomes than any other system in North Carolina for our clients. So we have always wanted public defender offices, but there's been a lot of pushback when we try to open up new offices in North Carolina. Well, a decade of low rates have driven so many attorneys out of our system. We now have people coming to us saying, please open up a public defender office here. We don't have enough attorneys. We can't find people to do felony cases. And so our new leadership, our long-term strategic plan is to make North Carolina a public defender state, is to have a public defender system everywhere where it makes financial sense. And it's ironic that these low rates have been one of the main reasons that we're going to be able to probably do that. Just saying, weird.
So I saw there's a question in the chat from Andy. He rightly praises Chris's offer to help people do these analyses, and as I said, he backs it up. He helped me out a lot in designing the survey. So what do we estimate these studies cost to do in terms of resources and time? And even if you couldn't do it yourself, can you estimate how much it would cost if someone wanted to pay to get it done? So I would, in Indiana, if you pay to get it done with like a private public partnership, which is things that our agency has done, I don't know, it would probably be much more expensive than doing it in-house. In my experience, those projects tend to balloon out of control. In terms of like the resources in the office, it was very cheap, but that was intentional because we didn't really have a budget for it. So at the time, especially, we didn't really have any funds that could go towards research. So we didn't pay people to even participate. It was all through the goodness of their heart. So it was very cheap. It was basically just my time, and my time in addition to all my other job duties. So 1/10 of my salary for a couple months or something. So it's quite cheap. I'll let the other speakers say theirs.
We put out a request for proposals on a different research project relating to caseload studies, and that was won by the Rand Corporation. I don't know if I can, I assume I can say how much. I'm not going to, but similar things were involved, similar surveys, spending time with attorneys, tens of thousands. I mean, not cheap. I'll find out if I don't see why we couldn't, but I just don't want to say that just in case. But I'll let Andy or someone know, and that can be circulated. So, or at least some sort of estimate, but very expensive. And Torrin's right, it balloons really quickly.
And then Margaret, you answered in the chat, is that right?
And I would say that the biggest amount of time is the survey tool. But if you like a survey tool that's already been developed and you just take that will reduce a lot of work. And the second is getting however you're going to contact your attorney. So if you already have that list available, then you could probably replicate a study with minimal labor resources if you used an already existing tool and you had somebody who could, just do the contacting and analyze the data, of course.
And I think depending where you're living, you might be able to find a university that has a graduate or undergraduate program with someone looking for a project, and they could take this on. I think I've been approached by some college students about doing surveys in the area that I practice. And I think that would be, I mean, they're working for credits and not for dollars. So that's always a savings I'm looking for.
I agree. I think academic partnerships can be very helpful, although they can also get expensive too, depending on how they're done. But obviously that option is a great one if you're trying to keep costs down. Just following the chat. Looks like the Sign Council Association for New York State put some contact info in the chat. Please do check that out. info@acanys.net. And then who was it that said this? Sorry. Patricia Warth says, even if you do have a public defender office, you do need a good assigned counsel program for conflicts, which is definitely true. Even in the counties that I think have very well-funded offices, there's a very significant assigned counsel, or in our case, sometimes they're contractors for conflicts. But yeah, those programs can't be left behind, even if the goal is to get a well-funded public defender office. I definitely agree with that here. I see. I don't know if this is in. Yeah. So Amelia, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, this is such a great presentation. Thank you so much. Kathleen, I wanted to go back to one of your comments around the cost of law school loans. I'm just wondering if any of the reports looked at that. We, in Washington State, we contract for parent representation, and some of our contractors are at public defender agencies that can qualify for public interest loan forgiveness. So can solo practitioners. Some are in law firms that cannot qualify. And it just feels like we're in the middle of a pending train wreck with law school loans going up and up.
I'd like to comment about, that's a great point, Amelia. None of our attorneys, since they are independent contractors, none of them qualify for loan forgiveness. And we've actually tried, and none of them qualify. People who are at public defender's offices or legal aid society, they do qualify, but none of our panel attorneys, as we call them. And in fact, one of these committees I'm on, that's our next agenda item after we get the rates increased. And like you said, the parental representation is a whole nother problem in New York, because at least in Onondaga County, it's handled by a legal aid society who is chronically underfunded. This idea of parity is, compared to like the county law department attorneys who prosecute the family court side, it's a crime what's going on. So yeah, that's another whole issue. But yeah, thank you for mentioning it about the law school loans.
Part of our analysis that, like I mentioned, our survey took a broad perspective, and part of it was about decisions and what impacts the decisions for how an attorney operates. And one of the pieces of information that did come across fairly strongly is that those law school loans and the repayment process does heavily factor into new graduates' decisions. Not in a way that it did when it may have been cheaper. And I don't really want to get into that, mainly because I don't know a lot about what law school used to cost versus now. But it seems like initially in folks' careers, they took indigent defense as something that they wanted to do and were more comfortable able to do it. But the newer graduates or the newer generation of law students are not able to take as many indigent defense cases as, say, an earlier generation may have been, because frankly, the loan, I mean, any of us who have gone to school recently, we understand that it can feel like a weight around your neck. And unfortunately, what that does is decrease the number of attorneys willing to represent indigent clients, which causes problems. Because, I mean, typically, if you think about it in a market, there would be some sort of adjustments made. Well, when you can't adjust one side of the curve, there becomes just a problem. It doesn't function efficiently, and you have fewer attorneys still representing far more people, and there's only so much time that they can spend. So it does have a theoretical impact on the client, on indigent clients rather.
All right. Thanks again to the panelists. I think we're right at an hour here. I think we'll cut it here, but definitely if anyone has questions or is interested in like starting a program, like reach out to the panelists, reach out to me. You can just reach out to the IDRA listserv if you don't have contact information, or you can reach out directly to me. I'll put it in the chat. Again, thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the audience. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks to IDRA.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
You too.